Stephanie Feldstein is the Population and Sustainability Director at the Center for Biological Diversity, where she heads a national program that addresses the connection between human population growth, overconsumption, and the wildlife extinction crisis. She created the innovative Take Extinction Off Your Plate campaign, and her work has been featured in the Huffington Post, NPR, Salon, The Guardian, and the Washington Post, among other places. Stephanie has more than 20 years of experience in animal rescue and advocacy, and she's the author of The Animal Lover's Guide to Changing the World: Practical Advice and Everyday Actions for a More Sustainable, Humane, and Compassionate Planet. Thank you so much for taking the time today, Stephanie.
Thanks for having me.
For sure. And so I'm always love to know about people's journey to veganism. How did that happen for you?
Well, it started for me back in high school. I was one of those kids who's always an animal lover, but back then there wasn't quite as much information so readily available as there is today. We didn't have as many of the undercover investigations and that sort of thing happening to expose what our food system really looked like. At a used book sale, Animal Liberation
Oh,
by
I
Peter
remember.
Singer. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
So I picked up a copy of that, and that really opened my eyes to just how bad things were. And at that point, I went vegetarian overnight. It was many, many years, though, before I became fully vegan. I think, like a lot of people, I grew up in the Midwest, and there weren't a lot of options in the area. And especially back then, there weren't as many options. And so it was much harder for me to make that final step. And that happened much, much later, as I started doing more of the work, not just on the side for animals, but also for the environment. And then, as options became more available, I was able to finally make that switch and become vegan.
So you were probably alone in this journey at that time. Yeah?
Yeah, absolutely. Nobody in my family was vegetarian. It's the Midwest. We barbecued almost every night, so there were definitely some challenges there. It got a little bit easier as I got older, as I lived in different places, as I, went to college, and there were more people who were, thinking about these same issues. But yeah, for a while it was just me, trying to do what I could to eat ethically.
Good for you for staying true to your convictions. That takes a lot of courage for sure. And so, thankfully, it's a lot easier now. There really is no excuse nowadays. And so, what is the Center for Biological Diversity? How long have you been there? And it sounds like you're playing a fundamental role there with the Take Extinction Off Your Plate campaign.
Yeah, so the Center for Biological Diversity is a national conservation nonprofit organization. We work to save wildlife and wild places. I've been with the center for about 7 years now, running the Population and Sustainability Program, as you mentioned. And as part of that, when we originally the program was just focused on population growth and looking at what's the impact as our population keeps growing exponentially. How are we really crowding out wildlife in different ways? And we realized we had to really address the other side of that coin, that it's not just the number of people, it's also what are we doing to the planet. And as we looked at what those factors are, we realized that really one of the most destructive industries on the planet was animal agriculture, and that we had to address that head on. And so that's when we launched the Take Extinction Off Your Plate campaign about 6 years ago. And it's a campaign that helps people make the connections between meat and dairy production and the wildlife extinction crisis. And the importance of shifting toward plant-based diets as a way to protect wildlife and the environment. And we also work on, all the different policies that can help make that happen. Because even though foods are more widely available now, there are still a lot of barriers. And there's still a lot of policy that's tipped very much in the favor of animal agriculture. So we're working to change that as well.
Yeah, it's true. We're up against a massive industry, but it sounds like you guys have had some success through the years. Can you share some of those with us?
Yeah, absolutely. We've done quite a bit of work to elevate the importance of adding sustainability into into federal policy. So we really did a lot to change the narrative around dietary guidelines. We're still working to get sustainability in the dietary guidelines. There are some big political barriers there, but it's something that's on the table now. That has been a big part of the conversation of the past 2 cycles of the dietary guidelines updates, even though the Trump administration tried to keep it out of the conversation. So I think we did quite a bit around that. We have also worked to pressure restaurants as well as food service providers and universities and schools to really add more plant-based items to their menu, and we're really seeing a lot of positive changes in those areas as well.
Cool. And then in terms of actually protecting some endangered species, I think you've had some success there as well.
Yeah, the center has been around for more than 25 years. And in that time, we've helped more than 700 species get listed on for endangered species protections. And we've also helped protect more than 500 million acres of habitat, because of course, if the animals don't have a place to live, they're not going to make it. So that habitat piece is just as important as getting the protections.
Right. And so does the federal legislation, the environmental protection legislation, does it still have some teeth?
Yeah, there have been a lot of efforts to weaken it, but we still have some of the best environmental protection laws in the world. The Endangered Species Act, when it is used, is very effective. We've seen a lot of success stories in helping save species from extinction, to bring them back from the brink. So that is a particularly effective law. We also have the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act. When they are implemented, are very effective. Of course, when we're talking about food, there are so many exemptions and loopholes for animal agriculture, and we're working to close those. But there's the bones of those laws are still very, very effective.
And so what's that relationship? Like, I think it's very similar in Canada, where there's just this very tight connection, from between lobbyists and government, and then also in terms of money flowing back and forth. So I know you're probably not aware of what's going on in Canada, but it's very similar to what's going on in the US. Could you explain that relationship?
Yeah, when I've talked to colleagues who work on these issues in other parts of the world, the meat and dairy lobby in the U.S., it's really one of the most powerful lobbies in the world, and even see them intervene in other places, because they'll do anything they can to protect their interests here. So there is a very close relationship. There's a lot of money that's flowing from the meat and dairy industry into lobbying. There's actually a recent report that showed that all of the major meat production companies, the big ones like JBS and Cargill and those ones, that they have all spent a lot of money actively fighting climate change legislation, that they've really poured a lot into that. And in return, not only do we see that there are, real policy implications of that and all these exemptions that we see for animal agriculture, but we also see quite a bit of money flowing from the government back into the industry. When you look at things like the bailout packages that came to supposedly to help farmers who were affected by the pandemic, most of that money wound up going to these giant agribusinesses that were primarily producing meat and dairy. So we see a lot of that, and it's not just these bailout programs, and a lot of the regular agricultural loans and surplus purchases and all of those things that that's where the government money is going. It's usually lining the pockets of the meat and dairy industry.
Yeah, it's very problematic considering all the things we can think that we could use tax money for, rather than propping up this industry. And so when you say fighting climate change legislation, so it seems to me if they're specifically targeting legislation, they understand then that there's a connection between what they're doing and climate change. But I'm not sure that's made clear by a lot of climate activists and environmental activists. Don't necessarily make that connection, but that's where you guys come in, right? That you to try to help people understand directly there's a direct correlation, and we need to know about that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the conversation is starting to change because, like 6 years ago when we started our Take Extinction Off Your Plate campaign, there were some studies out at the time that had talked about how significant a contributor animal agriculture was to the climate crisis, but they weren't getting a lot of attention. And since then, we have seen dozens and dozens more studies come out that reaffirm this. And we're also seeing the narrative change. Just recently, the UN released a report on methane, and a big part of that methane report is talking about the impact of animal agriculture, since it's such a huge source of methane. And so we're starting to see it creep into policy. We're seeing it being mentioned. There's not enough action around it yet, but we are seeing it mentioned in climate action plans and things like that. So that narrative is starting to change, but we're still in a much earlier phase of people really understanding the urgency and what needs to be done about it compared to, say, understanding that we need to shift away from fossil fuels to 100% clean renewable energy.
Right, and that's a very important part of it too. But I really like that your approach is to look at our lifestyles and what we're doing, and because we're empowered with that, right? And it's instantaneous results. Like I can't change what's going on in the rest of the world right now, but I can change what I'm going to have for lunch. Today I can do that. And specifically methane, I've heard it said that methane is one of those greenhouse gases that we can get a grip on within a decade or so. Like it quickly dissipates. Is that right?
Yes, methane doesn't stay in the atmosphere very long, only for about a decade or so. But in the time that it's in the atmosphere, it's significantly more potent than carbon dioxide. So, what that means is that if we continue to ignore methane, then we're continuing to accelerate the climate crisis. But, like you said, if we can rapidly reduce the amount of methane, that will take a huge chunk out of our emissions. That will really get us much closer to the climate targets that we need to reach within the next 10 years as we continue to work on these longer term solutions of reducing the other greenhouse gases.
And so, what role does animal agriculture play in the production of methane?
Well, in the United States, animal agriculture is the largest source of methane. So it plays a huge role in that. The biggest source of that is definitely beef by far. A lot of times there's more of a focus on beef because that is where we can have the most rapid emissions reductions. But we always like to make it clear that, you know, we may need steeper reductions and more immediate reductions in beef than other animal products, but that should mean switching to plant-based foods, that the ultimate goal is more of a plant-centered diet. And you can't just shift from beef to chicken because chicken still has more emissions compared to like beans, for example, as well as being responsible for far greater environmental impacts in other areas, like water pollution and those sorts of things.
So you're not seeing that feeding, different. What are they trying to feed? Lime grass or something? Different kinds of grasses to cows to reduce the methane. That's not necessarily going to get us where we want to be.
No, I think there was one that looked at lemongrass, and then there's been a lot of talk about seaweed, and there are a couple of things that misses, and one is that there is no evidence that that is going to get us anywhere near where we need to be with the emissions reductions. I mean, we're in a climate crisis, and we need to have emissions in the next 10 years to avoid like the worst impacts of climate change. So there's no evidence that that's going to get us anywhere near that. And then there's the bigger problem with that too is that you'll see like what does it mean to produce that level of these additional crops, whether that's seaweed or whether that's lemongrass or something else, to feed these millions and millions of large animals that we have. Like there's still a land cost for that, there's still a climate cost for that, and we're just not seeing that any of these mitigation solutions are going to get us where we need to be, unless we start drastically reducing the number of animals that are being raised for food.
Right. So let's shift then from talking about the climate implications to just the environmental implications of all these. There's way, way more animals on the planet than there are humans at any given time, and they're occupying a lot more land and using a lot more resources, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It takes something like 20 times more land to raise cattle than it does to grow beans. For the same amount, like for the same serving size. So, I mean, it's just an outrageously higher amount of demands on not just our land, but also other resources like water. I mean, a huge amount of the total water use in the United States, I think it's something like about a quarter of the water use in the United States goes just toward feed crops for cattle in the West. So that's not even the entire herd. It's not even all of the water that goes into raising the animals themselves or into the slaughter process or anything like that. It's just that one piece of it. I mean, it's just massive, massive amounts of resources that that are going into this industry.
Right. And then the pollution from these animals that are producing manure and runoff into the water supply.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's most of the rivers. I think there's something around half or more than half of rivers in the U.S. have been impaired by manure and runoff from factory farms and from these animals. And I think it's also important too to talk about the direct threats to wildlife that come from this industry. I mean, of course, it's harmful to wildlife when we are depleting rivers, and it's harmful to wildlife when we are destroying and degrading their habitat. But there's also a lot of direct threats. I mean, the meat and dairy industry are at the root of our conflicts with wolves and the endangerment to species like wolves and grizzly bears. But also there are animals like prairie dogs that are who are killed by the thousands every year because their burrows create hazards for grazing cattle. So they kill them off to clear the land for cattle. Amazingly, this one has always blown my mind, but the USDA even sprays pesticides to kill off grasshoppers so that they don't eat the grass so that it can be saved for cattle. I mean, it's just really from the smallest to the largest wild animals that we have in this country, they are being directly targeted to protect the interests of meat and dairy producers.
And don't cattle ranchers get free land or something in the U.S. as well?
Well, they get very, very cheap leases to be able to graze their cattle on public lands. So, us and others have done studies into those grazing fees and how little they've changed over the decades, how little they account for the amount of damage that cattle do to these public lands. So yeah, they get close to free range over, many of these public lands that are supposed to really belong to all of us as the American people.
Right. And like you say, if they're spraying pesticides and they're destroying all the other life forms that are trying to live there, that's something that you should get to vote on at least, I would think. Yeah. And so
Right.
there's something called wildlife services. What isn't their job to kind of protect wildlife?
Well, unfortunately, wildlife services, the main service they provide is killing wildlife. They're this fairly secretive arm that's under the US Department of Agriculture. They have very little oversight and they kill about 1 million native animals a year, and oftentimes in pretty horrific ways. And some of those ways that include things like these little cyanide bombs that are, that when the animal sniffs them, they kind of explode in their face and poison them, and setting, very inhumane traps and those sorts of things. And these are also hazards, of course, for people and their companion animals who live in the areas where these traps are set. So, there are huge problems with this. It's very little oversight as to whether the animals who are targeted, whether there's good scientific reason to do so, right? Whether there's any proof that it will reduce predation if they, when they're targeting wolves or coyotes or other animals. And although Wildlife Services doesn't work exclusively for the livestock industry, much of the damage that they do is on behalf of that industry.
Hmm. Well, and we know, I mean, historically, if we look at our nation, our continent here, our ancestors came here and cleared the land primarily for agriculture, I think, right? And so there's still the clearing of land is ongoing, and people, especially indigenous people, are concerned about the loss of these wild spaces, and and So can you speak to that? And because there's a big locavore movement, like the idea of eating local, and I'm all in favor of that. I try to buy local veggies whenever I can, but is that the solution then to move away from these CAFOs and concentrated animal agriculture and just focus on locally raised animals? Is that a possibility for the future?
Well, there are a lot of benefits to local agriculture. I mean, it supports local economies. In many cases, it's supporting smaller, more independent farms. But I will say, not exclusively, because the local movement it's just that. It's a geographic term. So sometimes you can find that you may be supporting a local farm, but it just happens to be a factory farm that's in your backyard. So I think that we need to go beyond that term of just local. But the other thing to consider when it comes to, I think the ideals that are behind the locavore movement is thinking more about, pasture raised and grass fed animals, thinking about what are more humane practices, how do they, integrate animals better with the land, ideally have more respect for wildlife and use non lethal um, predator management and those sorts of tactics. But even with those ideals, none of that is possible unless we drastically reduce the amount of meat that we're eating in this country. There was a recent study that was done that looked at what would happen if the entire US beef supply was switched over to a grass fed system. And it found that existing pasture land in the US could only support 27% of the current beef supply. And so that means anything above that would have to expand even further beyond the land that the industry has already taken over. And so that means that where would it go? I mean, exactly into those places that what are the remaining places that are still wild? What are the remaining places that, that indigenous people have still been able to hold on to? And there's not much of that left as it is, and expanding, switching over to these more, more idealistic and more local ways of raising livestock really still has severe limitations.
Yeah, it seems globally it's not going to be a solution. I mean, that's I think the reason why we went from kind of backyard farms into factory farms is because of the massive population on the earth, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's simply not enough room. It's really an efficiency thing, right? It turned raising food, which should be something that is, one, everybody should have access to healthy food, and we should have that greater connection to how is the way that we're raising food affecting the land that we live on and the environment that we all need to survive and the environment that we need to keep growing that food, right? That should all be interconnected, but it was turned into an industry, right? It was turned into just a commodity. And at that point, it became all about efficiency. It became less about, the health of the animals, the health of the people who were going to ultimately eat them, and definitely the health of the environment. And it just became about how do we cut corners? How do we produce as many animals as possible in in the smallest, cheapest way possible? So that's we wound up with the factory farms with that, and I think it's a huge mistake that that we need to figure out how do we undo that.
It's a failed experiment. Absolutely.
Exactly.
And especially now that with COVID, right? Now we're becoming aware that infectious diseases like SARS and MERS and swine flu and avian flu and now COVID. I mean, I didn't know prior to COVID, it never occurred to me where the source of these things, even though they were called swine flu and avian flu, I never understood the science. But now we have Dr. Greger and others explaining how that works. And so, do you find there's a growing awareness because of COVID about an extra reason to switch to plant based?
Yeah, I think COVID has opened people's eyes to a lot of things. I think one thing to note is that COVID itself is not believed to have come from a factory farm, but we have seen previous diseases in the past, and we do know that factory farms are petri dishes for future pandemics. Like, there's no question about that. But they also, our factory farming system did have an impact on COVID because COVID was believed to have come from the wildlife trade, but what happens is that because more and more land, like we were just discussing, is being cleared to grow feed crops for for farmed animals and to graze animals on, that as we clear that land, it's bringing people and wildlife closer and closer together, and it increases the risks of those disease transmissions for diseases like COVID. But the other thing is that, like, so absolutely, I think it's raised a lot of questions about, what is our relationship with animals, both wild and domestic, and what are we doing that is increasing our own risk as well as theirs. But I think the other thing that's really come to light in during this pandemic is, the horrific treatment of workers in the meat and dairy industry. That's one area in particular where I've seen a lot of people's eyes opened when they saw just how much people are exploited as part of this industry, as well as the animals being exploited. And people were not given even basic protective equipment. They were not given time off when they were sick. They were basically told, if you don't come in, you lose your job. So people were coming in, and we just saw huge amounts of COVID spread happening, not just in places like meatpacking plants and in slaughterhouses, in those places themselves, but then also into the surrounding communities around those facilities. And so I think, like, as more and more was exposed about just how exploited and vulnerable these workers are, just how horrific this industry is on every level, that I saw a lot more conversation happening and a lot more attention being paid to, like, just how broken this system is on all levels.
A lot of the people who work in these places are migrant workers, or they're people who've been released from prison, and this is the only place that they can get a job. Like, it's really, I think, hopefully, it's opening a lot of eyes. And is this similar around the world, do you know, or is this kind of exclusively a North American phenomenon?
Well, I think in North America, we kind of gave birth to the factory farm, right? But it's, we are seeing this model expanding more in other parts of the world. So I think it's a problem that we'll see increasing in other parts of the world if we don't start to to change what we eat and how we approach our food system. And I think anywhere in the world, things like slaughtering animals and meat packing, like, those aren't going to be the highest paying desirable jobs. I mean, those are inherently lower wage jobs, unfortunately. And I think that's that we will see more of that exploitation in other parts of the world as well.
Mm. And what about antibiotic resistance? That's another concern, right? Because a lot of I think the most amount of antibiotics are fed to animals because they're in these unsanitary conditions, and they don't want them to get sick. So that's also contributing to a potentially enormous health crisis.
Yeah, absolutely. It's something like 70% of antibiotics are being fed to farmed animals, and it's fed to them for two reasons. One, to try to accelerate their growth, to get them to slaughter faster. And then the other one is to compensate for the unsanitary conditions where they're raised. So it's given in a very preventative way, not because, like, there are just so many animals and they need them, but it's given in a way that is, that's trying to prevent disease because of the situation that they're raised in. So, I mean, I think that that's an important distinction. And a lot of these antibiotics are medically important for people. And the more frequently that they are, just used and used without reason, the more that, bacteria are smart organisms and they are adapting. And as those antibiotics are just out in the world, the bacteria are learning to adapt to them, which means that those antibiotics become less useful when we really need them.
Right, and also the virus. We're seeing how the virus mutates, right? And so it can go into the workers, as you mentioned, but then it's also going back into animals, especially mink. We've heard about, and where it's recombining itself. And now I've heard that it can actually, in fact, go from humans now into wild animal populations.
Yeah, I'm less familiar with spread directly from humans into wildlife, but one thing that we are really concerned about is, is that mink connection, because mink are very closely related to several wild species. You're of course talking about mink who are being raised in fur farms, and that's where we've seen positive COVID tests. And oftentimes those mink are either, interacting with, or they escape from the farms, and then they pose a threat to, to their wild relatives.
Okay, so there's lots of many new good reasons, including the health implications that we sort of touched on. And there was recently, it sounds like it's even reached the levels of government and media, which is awesome. So there was a Burgergate, I think it's being called, this idea that there was some, I didn't really even follow it. What was Burgergate all about, and what was your response to it?
So what happened was, President Biden has been releasing his climate plans. He's recognized that we need ambitious climate action, and he started to release plans about what that will look like. When his climate plan was being released, the Daily Mail in the UK made a connection between his climate plan and a study that came out a year ago that looked at different diet scenarios in the US, including one that's looked at what would be the greenhouse gas emission savings if everybody in the US ate 90% less beef and 50% less of all other animal products. And of course, the savings were huge. I mean, it would save something like 2 billion tons of greenhouse gas emissions over the course of a decade. So the savings would be huge. But the Daily Mail connected that to Biden's action plan and had this really sensational headline about how, Biden was going to, cut beef by 90%. Americans would only be able to eat one hamburger a month. And this was then picked up by Fox News. And from there, it just sort of spread like wildfire through right-wing media and right-wing pundits who, got very upset and angry that Biden was going to ban beef, and and what an outrage that would be. And the reality is not only was this a false connection made with a study that came out a year ago, but there's nothing in Biden's plan about meat consumption. And in fact, he said very little at all about addressing the emissions from animal agriculture so far.
So what would you say to President Biden about all of this?
Well, even though reducing meat was not in his climate plan, it absolutely should be. And, there are just so many actions that his administration can take to help us change the way we eat. And that doesn't have to be, an outright ban on meat. That's frankly ridiculous. Like it wouldn't happen. There are a variety of issues with it. That's not even something that's on the table or that anybody is actually talking about.
I'd support it. Yeah.
It's something that, that there may be supporters for it in theory, but the actual mechanics of that as policy, like it doesn't work. But the things that actually do work is recognizing that food policy is climate policy. And if President Biden is going to take the climate crisis seriously, then every single policy and program that deals with food and nutrition has to be aligned with the climate goals. And that has to be moving towards less meat. So that includes things like sustainable dietary guidelines, like shifting some of that funding we were talking about earlier, that, the millions and millions of dollars that the USDA gives out every year, and the purchases that the government makes, and really shifting that from the meat industry that's getting the lion's share of it now over to, climate friendly plant-based foods.
Right, or transitioning, I guess, the meat industry. There's talk of that in Canada about taking the money that is going, the subsidies that are going, and saying, okay, you can still have this money, but you need to transition away from animal agriculture. Is there any such movement in the U.S. that you're aware of?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, not at the government level, but in terms of those of us advocating for it, absolutely, that's part of the picture. Because we are sensitive to the fact that there are, a lot of farmers out there that they're either raising feed crops or raising animals because that's what they're being paid to do. That's what's profitable. And a lot of that is because of the way that, that these subsidies and other payments are structured from the government. So, when the administration is floating ideas around things like incentives for, for ranchers to sequester carbon in the soil, I'd love to see those incentives, just like you said, shifted over to, encouraging ranchers to change what they're raising and what they're growing, and to shift over from animal agriculture to plant-based agriculture. And we do need to see that happen, and that is going to need government support.
Yeah, I've seen some of that. There's a chicken farm that transitioned into mushrooms. I think that's kind of famous. Mercy for Animals, I think, helped with that transition. So, and the people are happier. They were never really happy doing what they were doing to chickens, and it allows people to reclaim their humanity, and it's healthier for everybody. What regarding the action plan for climate? There was a lot of hope and optimism that the new president and the new administration was going to champion things in a different way than previous administrations. Is there anything that we can be hopeful about regarding any action plan coming from this administration?
I mean, I think right now the greatest source of hope is that the door is open on the conversation. Um, that's, I think that's the biggest thing that I can say right now, because everything else is an unknown. But that said, I mean, they are asking for input on how to transform food systems. They are asking for input on what they should do to create a climate smart agriculture plan. So, they are starting to think about these things. It's early in their process to know exactly where they land. It's, what we've heard so far, again, is really based on these voluntary incentives that really, won't be effective because there's no accountability, and it's not incentivizing the things that need to change the most. It's incentivizing these little tweaks like those feed additives, and not the greater issues of how do we change actually what we are growing in the first place. So, so the initial signals aren't showing massive change right now, but there is a lot of input happening right now with the administration. So, I think that there's some hope that the door is open and it's an ongoing conversation.
So is this a good time for people to lobby their elected officials to request such changes?
Yeah, I mean, I tend to believe it's always a good time because it helps to keep the issues we care most about on their radar. They do pay attention to to these types of things. So yeah, I would say absolutely, lobby your elected officials, let them know that you care about these issues, and let them know that that ultimately we do need to shift towards more plant-based agriculture and plant-based diets. And that's not something that just has to happen on the federal level. There's a lot that can happen at the local level, where sometimes our voices can be louder, to change what the procurement plans are. What are the foods that our cities and counties are spending their own money on? And they can change those policies so that it supports more plant-based food and buying less meat and dairy. Local governments can also, support educational programs to help people change their diets. They can support community gardens to, increase food sovereignty, give people more access to fresh, healthy produce. And so there are a lot of things that can happen at every level, and absolutely reach out to your officials.
And as you mentioned, school districts can have influence over the dairy program in schools, for example, right? The milk programs.
Well, in the US, it's hard for schools to influence that, because the dairy program in particular is one of the pieces that is really determined by the USDA. The National School Lunch Program has a lot of rules and regulations about what it will reimburse schools for. And, schools tend to have very tight budgets, so they pay very close attention to following those rules to make sure that they can get reimbursed as much as possible for the lunches that they're providing. We are working, and I think that this is something where schools as well can have a voice on this in, urging the USDA to change those rules, because we want to see the USDA change that requirement from being dairy milk to always having plant-based milk side by side. So I think that's one area that people can get involved. But there are ways, even within the restrictions of the school lunch program, for schools to mix up their menus and add more plant-based options, because even though the choices are more limited than what we would want to see, there are options for things like beans and tofu and tempeh, and there are movements to get more of the plant-based alternatives included in the school lunch program. And so, it'd be great for local schools to take advantage of that, to start trying out things like meatless Mondays, to start testing recipes with kids, and and getting the kids excited about new things that they can eat that are that are exciting and delicious and better for them and the planet.
Mm-hmm. All right. And you've mentioned that we have to also disrupt capitalism. So a lot of this is entrenched, this flow of money and industry relation to government and is entrenched in this capitalist economic system. And the idea that we can just keep growing and growing and without any repercussions. Well, we're seeing some of those repercussions. And so, what do you want to say about that? You've also talked about, the money flowing towards not just supporting the production of meat and dairy, but the surplus and the food waste. Like, how do we can we work on the problem without looking at the source, which I think a lot of us believe is rooted in capitalism?
Yeah, I think, I mean, there's a lot to unpack there. And I think, one of the things that's key, specific to when we're talking about food and meat and dairy, is that right now our system produces the overproduction of it. We've seen stories of, when prices start to drop, dairy farmers will just start dumping milk. So everything that's going into that, all of the natural resources, all of the suffering that goes into that is just being wasted. They're dumping milk to artificially keep prices higher, mm-hmm. so as not to flood the market. And we see the USDA spend millions of dollars every year buying surplus cheese, so cheese that nobody is buying. It's not a free market economy, as people who defend it would like to believe, because we are seeing it being propped up in all of these ways. And yeah, I think, like you said, it's the problem with capitalism behind this is that idea of just like endless growth. I mean, that's really, like we were talking about earlier, what drove that that efficiency of this, of turning, producing food, the thing that we all need, into this efficient industry. And I think that that's where, we really saw a huge turn, and that's what needs to change. So it's hard to unpack exactly how that happens. I think that this is one area where local economies can play a larger role. This is something that at the local level, where you can support those who who are producing around you the foods that you want to see them produce and the way that you want to see it produced. There are also a lot of ways that local economies can get involved in in more reuse and more types of sharing economy type of of practices that can help to start to disrupt capitalism in smaller ways. But there's definitely a larger conversation that needs to happen there.
Yeah, and I think communities, certainly where I live, people are having those conversations. And there was a transition town movement a few years back of people imagining what could we do differently in planting nut trees in neighborhoods and fruit trees and that sort of thing. And I think the idea of supply and demand is a good one. I mean, it makes sense to me. But as you're saying, that's not really what's happening. They're not paying attention to demand. They're just producing, and then getting paid to dump all the excess. So, yeah, we need to talk about that a lot. Okay, and then the other thing I'd like to talk about, unless you want to say anything more there, is your book, The Animal Lover's Guide to Changing the World, Practical Advice and Everyday Actions for a More Sustainable, Humane, and Compassionate Planet. So what inspired you to write that book?
So I wrote the Animal Lover's Guide because, like I said, I was this kid who always loved animals, and I just didn't know what I could do to help them. And then even, as I got older and as I started, through my career to work for animal protection and to work in the environmental movement, I realized that there were all of these ways that I didn't realize my life intersected with the lives of other animals, and all of the things that I could do to help protect them. So I wrote the book to really be able to share that knowledge, to really help empower people, to know that there's so much that they can do to help animals, and also to help people realize, a lot of times I think, people get really involved with and really passionate about one area of animal protection, whether that's, the vegan movement focused on, or the parts of that may be focused on, food and farmed animals, or whether it's people who are focused on protecting wildlife, or people who just really, really love their dog and hate to see animal cruelty against dogs. But I think, people, these same folks often care about other animals as well. And so I really wanted to help, people see the connections between all of these different pieces of our movement, and the connections that, there are so many of the same, underlying themes of, why animals are harmed in this way, and how our actions affect that, and how we can create change to affect it in a more positive way.
Cool. Yeah. It's surprising how many people I talk to have a similar story to yours, where in their teen years they suddenly realize that they just didn't want to be eating animals. But of course, you're stuck in a place where you're a victim to the surroundings and the parental situation, and it's hard to change. So this sounds like a perfect book for young adults, especially, or at any age. We can be vegan at any age. And so where can people find that book and your website?
So my website, my personal website, where, with the book, is just stephaniefeldstein.com. You can learn more about our food work from the Center for Biological Diversity at takeextinctionoffyourplate.com. And my book is available wherever books are sold. So your local bookstore, if they don't have it in stock, they'll be able to get it. You can order it, online from various retailers. The big booksellers like Barnes and Nobles and folks like that have it as well. So um,
Thank you. Yes, it's important to continue to support our local bookstores and go directly to them to order things for sure. Thank you. Yeah. And so, one final question then is, what are some of your favorite foods?
That's a tough question, because there are just so many options now that it's it's gotten so much more exciting to eat vegan. I will say this time of year I do get really excited about just a big plate of grilled vegetables. Like, that basic is still so tasty to me. But I also love, Middle Eastern food and Ethiopian food, and Indian food. Like, I think that there are just so many amazing flavors out there for us to explore.
There are. Yeah, it's a nice time to be alive, especially this time of year when all the foods are starting to become more available as well. And so, finally, is there anything that you want to leave us with today, Stephanie?
Well, I think this has been a really great conversation. And, I just like to reiterate that, like we talked about earlier, this is an area where we have so much power as individuals. When we are, signing in to have this conversation or turning on the lights, like, we don't get to choose really where that power comes from. That's very limited by these monopoly utilities. But we have so much choice about what we put on our plates 3 times a day. But it's also so important to recognize that not everybody has the same choices. That sometimes that choice can be limited by, whether you have grocery stores nearby you, or what's on the menu and what's affordable. And so it's so important that we continue to push our elected officials to make sure that there is more equitable access to plant-based foods, that this sustainable diet is really something that is available and affordable to everybody.
All right. And just to be clear, you're also in favor of all the other things, like switching away from fossil fuels and all the other things. It's just that we also need to incorporate the animal agriculture piece, right?
Yeah, absolutely. The Center for Biological Diversity does a lot of work on the energy transition. That's a key part. We need to switch to 100% renewable energy. And we also, as we were talking about tying into the capitalism issue, we need to reduce our consumption overall of everything. There's just an enormous amount of waste that's happening. There's an enormous amount of things, from single-use plastics to, every time you go into the store and you buy something that you don't really need, there's a lot that went into that. And I'm not saying that people need to live a Spartan lifestyle, but just, starting by putting a little bit more thought into things. Like, is it something that's important to you? Is it something that you really need? Is it something that will really bring you happiness? Or is it something that's an impulse buy that maybe you can, put on hold and see if you still want it later? I think even those small steps of starting to reduce those unnecessary purchases can start to lighten our footprint overall. There's just a lot of different ways that we need to change the way we think about our impact on the planet.
Yeah, it's a liberating way to live simply so that others can simply live, right?
Hmm.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Stephanie. It's been lovely chatting with you.
You too. Thanks so much.